And joining us now on the debate, Katie Telford, Senior Consultant with Strategy Corp. Paul Rhodes, former Communications Director for the Ontario PC Party. Robin Sears, Senior Partner at Navigator Limited. Jim Harris, former leader of the Green Party of Canada. And Martin Redcon, Ontario politics columnist at the Toronto Star. You all look okay today for having been up to the wee small hours of the morning following this quite exciting election cliffhanger. For those who didn't make it up as late as you all did, Michael, if you would, let's bring up this graphic here indicating what happened last night. The first column there, that's where we left things at dissolution. 70 Liberals, 25 Progressive Conservatives, 10 New Democrats, no Greens. After last night's results, the Liberals now sit at 53 seats, the Conservatives at 37, the NDP at 17, still no Greens. The Liberals, as you can see, lost 17 seats, Tories up 12, NDP up 7, and the total vote last night, that 37.6%, which was only good for 53 seats for Mr. McGuinty last night, that same 37.6% got Bob Rae a majority government in 1990, exactly to the 10th of a point. Tim Hudak at 35.4%, Andrea Horwath 22.7%, and the Greens went down quite significantly, shy of 3% of the total votes cast. Okay, Katie, what did the people say last night?
I think Ontarians were saying they wanted a leader who could provide stability, that showed some hope for the future, and that was going to look after the things they cared about, like healthcare and education. At the same time, I think that the voters said, those people that did vote said, we're going to be paying attention, and we're going to put you on a bit of a shorter leash, as some have been saying today.
Tim Hudak said it last night. What
Well,
did the people say?
it's exactly a shorter leash. But what I think the people said last night was Ontario needs change, but not quite the move to change that we had hoped for, and I think certainly that the NDP had hoped for. But it's definitely a shorter leash, and will be a fascinating few months to see how government goes forward.
Robin.
You know, I think the most devastating result last night was that for the first time in Canadian history, more than half the voters said, we don't like any of you. And when
That's a reference to turnout.
When a province is going into as big a crisis environment as this, and more than half of your constituents say, we don't think any of you are competent to lead us through this, to me, that's a big slap at the political culture as a whole.
Jim.
I'd agree with Robin. It's a real threat to the legitimacy of government when more people do not vote than choose to vote. And we can dive into some of those reasons, but if you don't like the options that are being presented to you, why should you bother to vote? I don't know if you've ever seen the bumper sticker, Steve, don't vote, it only encourages them, right? So this cynicism and disillusionment is a very concerning trend.
Martin.
I agree with those last two comments. I think we have to remind people, though, that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And even if you don't like any one leader who fits your bill, you still have to, it's your duty to pick the person who is the least worst leader, because somebody has to choose. I don't think Ontarians spoke with one voice last night. I think we saw a couple of different arguments, but this idea that the Liberal leader, Dalton McGuinty, was put on a shorter leash, that same argument applies to the opposition. I think the Progressive Conservatives and the New Democrats were put on a shorter leash. They can't really try to flex their muscle as much as they might have dreamt in a minority government scenario.
Okay. Katie, we're going to follow up on the Premier. I know his job last night during his victory speech is to convey, I'm still the Premier. We still won. But the fact is he lost 17, he did. But nobody's going to kid anybody about the fact that he won and lost a lot of seats in the process, including 4 cabinet ministers. Did he convey what he needed to convey?
I think so. And he came out this morning, actually, in a press conference and talked about the major minority that he's got, and that his Minister of Finance, he's kept Minister Duncan on as Minister of Finance and asked him to go to work right away with an economic fall statement. So I think that strong leadership right out of the gate is him projecting exactly that.
He's shaking his head already.
Of course he is.
I thought it was one of the most graceless election night speeches I've ever seen.
Really? How come?
He should have shown some contrition. He showed none. He should have made a gesture to his opponents because of the circumstance he's in. He showed none. He gave a boring and wooden recitation of his campaign stump speech, and then spent the last 5 minutes thanking everybody under the sun. It sounded like a goodbye to me.
It was almost like the Academy Awards. There were so many thank yous going on.
Did it sound like a goodbye to you?
It sounded like a man who was very unhappy and very unsatisfied with the results in either direction. I mean, he's in a really tough spot. He's financially strapped in a variety of ways. If he were looking to return to a majority and move on, if he were defeated, he could move on. And now he's stuck until the next election. He had rumored a bit about leaving a few months ago, and now his options are much more limited than they were.
Well, for what it's worth, the Liberals would say he wasn't rumoring that he was leaving a few months ago.
No,
it was other people who were.
He made a mistake, I think, in an interview with, I believe it was the Globe or the Star, where he mused very slightly and then corrected himself. But it's usually those musings that are closer to
Well, he
home.
did again last night. You know, he mused about the fact that he and Terry had often longed for a quiet life, which I thought was quite weird in the context.
Jim, what did you think of the speech last night?
Well, he was obviously waiting to see, because all night it was kind of tipping 53, 54, 53, 54.
Didn't really matter that much at the end of the day, did it? Doesn't.
Well, I think that's why he was delaying so late. I mean, Katie was already in bed by.
Because she's got she's got a baby. Martin, what'd you think?
I can't agree. I think, having watched him up close, given his age and the 15 years he's put into the job, he's pretty energetic. If I could be that energetic that many years from now, it's not that many years, I wouldn't feel as if I was giving off signals of quitting. I haven't detected those musings about retiring in the last year. I really don't know where that's coming from. I think it would have been a similar speech if he'd gotten 54 as well. Let's not make too much of I don't want to defend any tactics that he might adopt in the next few weeks, but 53 seats is still puts him squarely in the Premier's chair for the first time in a century. That's not too bad.
Puts him what,
Squarely in the Premier's chair.
For the first time in a century?
Sorry, the first time that that a Liberal Premier has won 3 consecutive mandates in a century.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
That's not a bad outcome. I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that he came out way ahead of the opposition, but he still needs them. It's true.
Let's talk about the Tories for a second here. Paul, 2003, 2007, 2011. 3 consecutive elections. The Tories are 0 for 69 in the city of Toronto. How is it possible they haven't won a single seat in the 416 in 3 consecutive elections?
I think for the same reasons that Stephen Harper didn't win any seats in 416 in 2004, 2006, and 2008. So there is, for Conservatives, a great challenge in the city of Toronto, one that we have yet to meet, but one that we're going to continue to work on. As far as Tim's performance during the election, you mentioned those previous years. This is the best performance for a first-time PC leader since 1971, when Bill Davis won a majority after just becoming leader. So I think the sense within the party is that we have...
Miller in 85 was better.
Well, no, as far as the outcome was concerned. And
Miller came first in 85.
Well, he didn't end up that way.
Okay,
He ended up in
that's
the same
reasonable.
position that Tim Hudak's in now.
Okay, fair enough. What's the story with the Tories in Toronto?
Well, it's the cruelty of the first-past-the-post system in some respects. I mean, you know, you look at a great Tory candidate like Andrea Mandel Campbell. You know, she came very, very close, and she would have come a lot closer if there weren't a overwhelming majority to overcome in first-past-the-post politics. They're going to elect seats in Toronto soon, I think. More seriously than that for them, though, I think, Steve, is look what happened in that arc of seats across Northwest Metro, where Mr. Harper very cleverly found ways of building a coalition that brought together old and new Canadians of a variety of cultural backgrounds. And Paul, I don't say this to embarrass you, because I know you weren't involved in these choices, but attacking foreigners would not seem to me to be consistent with appealing to those voters. And I think they gave a message last night about how they felt.
Jim.
Well, I'd say, picking up on what Robin was talking about, the first-past-the-post system, it really divides our province. Because you can have, we've seen in federal elections, 400,000 Conservative votes in Toronto and not a single seat. And so that then means the caucus doesn't have anyone in it from the largest city in Ontario and Canada. And then that in turn skews the policy options because the Conservatives end up having to play to rural concerns, and it ends up being a self-perpetuating situation.
Another argument to fix the system or change the system. you would say.
Exactly, and you can see a tiny difference in 2% of the vote yields a huge difference in the number of seats.
Can the NDP, Martin, finally bury the ghost of Bob Rae, such as it exists?
Well, I think Andrea Horwath has buried the ghost of Howard Hampton. He's a leader who was a master of the policies, really was comfortable with his brief, but didn't connect with voters. Andrea Horwath, as a first-time New Democratic Party leader, her personality has resonated with Ontarians. And I think what we'll see in her is the potential to grow. I think as she masters her policy brief more and more, because I think there's a consensus that she can be a bit uneven. She had one not-so-good debate in Thunder Bay, which mercifully was not televised, another much stronger performance of which you were at and moderated. So I think she's got great growth, and in that sense has brought the party back to fighting distance now.
Robin, what do you say on the NDP?
I'll be much less gracious than Martin. Howard Hampton was a thoroughly unlikable political personality and conveyed that very professionally for many years to the party's detriment.
Although it was quite congenial in that seat last night, till 12:30 in the morning, I might add.
Just not a great decision for a leader from the very beginning. Andrea, I agree with Martin, though, is entirely the other side. I mean, she could read the phone book and be more compelling than Howard. And I think she has great growth potential. Bob Rae's legacy will be a ghost over the province and its politics as we go through yet another dreadful economic winter, and people will start making the comparisons back and forth. And I was speaking to some economists just before the campaign to sort of get a sense of what they thought the contrast would be, and I said, well, it won't be as bad as 1990. And they said, are you crazy? You didn't have $10 billion in debt and a structural deficit in 1990. That's our starting point today.
So maybe.
Yeah, I don't think that among those of us in the political chattering classes who watch this stuff with great enthusiasm, I think that who was premier before, is the ghost of Bob Rae gone? Yes. Is the ghost of Mike Harris gone? Yes. We are into new leaders, a new age, new issues, new challenges. So the more we spend looking backwards at, I mean, who did what, I mean, what the proper role is for all of these former leaders is not to be icons, but to be doing panel shows like this one. Howard Hampton, I mean, he was on Norm Sterling on TV. John Tory was on television too. I mean, it's like it's the retirement program for former premiers and former political hacks is to come on excellent programs like this one.
What I would say about the Bob Rae bugaboo is that a lot of the people who say Bob Rae is being banished will also keep referring to Mike Harris. So there's a bit of a double standard here. The Mike Harris ghost, I think, is still looming somewhat, or is still overshadowing politics.
Well, it's more recent.
Yeah. Well, they were both in the same decade, though. Let's remember, right?
Okay.
Well, and I think we saw Tim Hudak playing a similar kind of politics in the campaign, and Dalton McGuinty was able to play that to his advantage in talking about hope and a positive campaign, while we saw Tim Hudak being divisive and going after certain pieces of the population in a negative way. And I think that negativity lost out in the end. And there was a linking to Harris throughout all of that. That was part of the Liberal strategy that we saw from the summer on.
Jim, I want to talk about the Greens. You lost more than half your votes from last time. How come?
Well, a couple things. One, the Liberals very cleverly have moved around to usurp some of the green, like look at the Green Energy Act. They didn't name it the Conservative Energy Act. They didn't name it the Alternative Energy Act. It's very calculated.
So they poached your voters.
Well, they worked to put a green shine on their policies, but the decision to put $36 billion into nuclear is hardly green. So on one side, we had the Liberals working to green themselves, at least perceptually. On the other side, in the last election, we had a terrible faux pas by John Tory and the Conservatives of wanting to fund every educational variety. And it just did not make any sense. And the Green policy then was only to fund one system. And it really resonated with voters. And we poached a huge cadre of former progressive conservative voters in the last election.
So why didn't you guys beat that drum harder in this campaign?
Well, that issue really wasn't a ballot question this time around. Obviously, after the routing last time around, John Tory stepped down. The third thing is, remember in the last election, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth had just broken out onto the scene in 06, and it was an 07 election. He'd won a Nobel Award. Climate change was at an all-time high. So in terms of a concern. So what I'm going to argue is that the environment is a submarine issue. It can seep down, and it did this election in terms of priority. It was, pollsters found it was dead last after the economy and jobs and healthcare and so on. But it can surface at any time. So, these three factors, I think, combine to suppress the Green vote this time around. But Greens aren't going away, and the environmental crisis we face is just going to get worse. So, unfortunately, the worse it gets, the better it will get for the Green Party.
I want to get into some discussion now about how this next legislature is going to work, because it's been 26 years since we had a minority parliament in this province, and that means for a lot of our perhaps younger or newer viewers, they don't know how this works. So let's start with this. Andrea Horvath touched on it last night. Michael, roll tape, please.
Tonight, the people of Ontario gave 107 people from different parties a very important job. And they sent some important instructions to go along with that job too. And they go like this: we expect you to confront the challenges that we're facing. And we expect you to work together, and I am ready to do that. And I know Mr. McGuinty and Mr. Hudak are as well. Our team of New Democrats will work with all MPPs to make Ontario's government work.
Okay, you were there, Robin, 26 years ago at Queen's Park, the last time we had a minority parliament. So how does it work?
Well, I don't think that's the reference point, Steve. I think we have to go back another decade. I think that the first call that Mr. McGuinty should make is not to Mr. Peterson, but to Mr. Davis. Because in 1975 to 1977, Ontario really defined functional minority parliaments. I mean, that was a period everybody from all political tribes looked back to and says, that worked good. 85 was different. It was a contract between two partners, very toughly negotiated and signed and adhered to. We're not going to be there this time. We're going to be back in the 75-77 period. And sadly, as you said, for voters who don't remember that, their most recent experience of minority government is the hyper-hysterical nonsense in Ottawa over the last 5 years. It doesn't have to be that way. If the three leaders, and more importantly, the three House leaders, can talk to each other as peers and as colleagues, governing together a province through a period of crisis, we could have a very happy winter. But I wouldn't bet on it.
I'm scratching my memory banks here. Was your dad in Parliament at that time,
Yes.
75 to
Yes, he
77?
was.
Part of Bill Davis's
Yeah, he
cabinet?
was.
Mr. Trent?
So do you, from the Sioux, right? He represented the
Yeah.
Sioux? Okay, so remind us that. He seems to remember those 2 years as the glory days of how minority parliament can work. Is that the model we should be looking at now?
I think the model you look at is parties working together. And it wasn't 75 to 77, it was 75 right through to 81.
No, that's a fair
because
point.
in the
Yeah,
77
you're quite
election, there was a minority parliament returned. I think it can work. It can work with the commitment of all the parties. But what there needs to be, I think, in the government is a recognition of some accommodation of different views. Mr. Davis was wise enough to agree to issues like rent control, which were certainly not on the Conservative agenda, but something that he thought would be a way to keep Parliament together and keep the legislature working as it should. So I think an open mind, accommodation, Andrea Horvath's comments were absolutely right on, in my view, as a way to be able to keep an open mind to other options.
But the suggestion there, Katie, is that this government may have to pass things that it wouldn't normally pass in order to keep peace in the home. Can you conceive of something that the McGuinty government will now have to do that it might not want to have done, because there's more of them on the other side of the House than before?
Not really, actually, for two reasons. One, because the reality is what we've seen in Ottawa, for good or for bad, and I had the dubious distinction of working up there in the minority situation. They actually showed they could get things through. Harper could get things through, not in a way that folks on my side of the House approved of, but They could get things through just by holding firm and saying to the opposition, you decide if you want to trigger an election now. So you can do a bit of a put the shoe on the other foot. And we've seen that work, even if it didn't exactly lead to the most cordial of relations in the House. I do completely agree, though, that the House leadership, all of a sudden, that's going to become, those roles of House leader and whip and things like that are going to become more important than they've ever been. The legislature is going to be more important than we've seen in a long time. And caucus management is going to be something else that's going to be more important for all three parties. I actually don't see this as simply a responsibility for the Premier in this. It's all three party leaders are going to have to manage their caucuses, manage their House leadership and their legislative agendas in such a way that they can get some wins ahead of the next election.
But Martin, I remember back in 1979, Joe Clark won a minority government federally, but he said, I'm going to govern as if I had a majority, which turned out to be not a great idea. But McGuinty's one seat short of a majority government. Should he govern as if he has a majority?
Well, I think you raise a good point, which is that this particular configuration is different than any other, so there is no exact analogy. On the other hand, Joe Clark, we all agree, blew it by trying to govern as if he had a majority. Stephen Harper adopted much that same approach and succeeded, more or less. He was able to call the timing of elections and ended up profiting from it all. So I don't think there are any exact analogies. What I would say, though, is that, first of all, Ottawa and Queen's Park are quite different dynamics. I've covered both. Queen's Park is a more intimate, smaller, there's less electricity in the air.
There's only three parties, too.
There's three parties. There are not as many reporters as in Ottawa. It's not as over-caffeinated and combative as Ottawa is. So there's more scope for human contact and compromise. The other thing to remember, though, is that the three parties, despite their different styles, leadership styles of the men and women in command, they actually aren't that far apart on some of the key issues. I can actually give you examples of where there's room to compromise. For example, Andrea Horwath's suggestion that the price of gas should be monitored, regulated, not set at a fixed price.
Capped.
Well, but what she's proposing is the same regime that they have in Quebec, New Brunswick, other liberal governments. So it isn't that you just have a band in which the price has to travel, that's all, so that you don't have huge variations. Small example, but there are others where they actually could find themselves pretty close together.
Let me try this with Robin. You know, the Conservatives and the New Democrats both said, let's take the HST off hydro, admittedly at different times, but that's what their policy is. Liberals said no. Could two opposition parties combine with the majority of the members in the House and force the McGuinty government to do that?
Absolutely they could. But I mean, let me just take a step back for a second, if I may, Steve. I think what everybody walking into the chamber this fall is going to be faced with is the recognition that Standard & Poor's and other bad external actors, if you're a government going into a recession, are going to be watching them like a hawk. And remember what happened to the Americans just a few weeks ago when they got into long budget squabbles and S&P downgraded them. And they said, we didn't downgrade you on the numbers, we downgraded you on the failure of leadership.
Yes, on your behavior, basically.
On your behavior. And so I think everybody in this context is going to be keenly aware of the attitude of the street about their behavior. And that will be an enormous pressure to good behavior. The big $64,000 question, $64 billion question maybe, is stimulus. You know, if we are really heading into the ditch, does this government and the federal government decide one more time they have to open the taps? And how does that work? And what are the politics of it internally? To me, that's the big challenge this fall.
Martin.
Can I just add, be helpful if I can, on the hydro issue, for example? Let's remind everyone that the New Democrats and Liberals are actually on the same page on hydro, because Andrea Horwath's policy was not to provide an additional rebate on the HST. She simply adopted the Liberal program, which was itself stolen from the NDP, to give the so-called clean energy rebate, benefit, thank you, of 10%. So there's actually a lot more commonality than one might assume on some of those issues.
Well, not on nuclear power, that's for sure.
Correct, but the Tories and Liberals are as one on nuclear.
We ain't going to build any nuclear plants in this environment. Where are we going to get the money?
No money.
But just on your earlier point, could the Conservatives and the NDP get together to pass something like that? I actually don't think they can, because a speaker has to come from somewhere with these numbers. And not to get too technical, but that normally comes from the opposition.
It's coming from
and
you.
and that
unless that person's tired of living, he will not volunteer for that job.
Well, but you get
Let's
nominated.
Can
you
we
don't
just
volunteer.
this is a key point. Let's do the math here. There's 53 liberals. There's 54 opponents.
Yep.
Someone's got to be the speaker. So, and you guys are floating the idea that it's going to come from the opposition
Well,
side, which would
it's
make
not
it.
even floating the
Good
idea.
luck
That is
with that.
traditionally the way. That is the way it
Well,
works.
let's be clear, but the person has to step up and be speaker. And with respect, if any of the opposition members would, and I would be more delicate than Robin was, but not much, they would be regarded in the very same reaction in the party as crossing the floor.
Well, hang on there.
It's exactly, look, if my MPP said, I want to run for speaker, I would have a very, very hard conversation with him to say, I don't think you want to do that because you will be regarded as having crossed the floor and given Mr. McGeady a majority.
In other words,
Translation, I'll break your legs.
No, I would just have a conversation, Robin. I'm a conservative. I'm much nicer than, well, not all that
No,
much.
I mean, it really is not realistic to think that the speaker is going to come from the opposition for reasons of arithmetic. And then we have the challenge of a fair number of rather elderly members of the government caucus who may decide that golf is more attractive than politics or medical reasons may intervene. Governments don't normally win by-elections in a recession. So I don't think that if I were a Liberal, I would look forward into the next 18 to 24 months as a period of ramping up towards majority, either by the trick that Katie describes or some other by-election victory. I think it's more likely to go the other way.
Well,
But
there's also
Robin,
the
we
potential-
can't forget history. Even though I'm not making any predictions, the pattern shows that people do cross the floor. David Ramsey and others. So in Ottawa as well.
Not
so
in this circumstance. The only one who's ever done it in this circumstance is Belinda Stronach, and ask her how she feels about how she was treated as a result of that.
she got a cabinet job out of it, a couple of years in power anyway. Let me do one more thing on the issue of how divided our province is or is not today as a result of all this. John Duffy, your boss, pal to many people around this table, pointed out that agricultural Ontario, if I can put it that way, really did go conservative last night. Half the mining and manufacturing area of the province went New Democrat. The Liberals are still in pretty good shape in the bigger cities of this province. Jim, to you first on this. Do we look like a province today that is much more divided than, say, before we knew what the results were last night?
I would say yes, and I'd go back to our electoral system. Our electoral system encourages that division, it celebrates it, it promotes it. And so let's not be surprised when we end up getting it. We have to look at the root cause of this problem, and it is the electoral system itself. I mean, at what point do we say we have to have alarm bells sounding? When we get to just 38% voter turnout and you win with 35%, in other words, should 15% of the population determine absolute power in the province? At what point do we say we have to overthrow this system? It is the system that's causing the problems.
We had a referendum about this 4 years ago, and we can have a long discussion about whether it was fair and well publicized and all of that, but we did a program on this yesterday. There doesn't appear to be any appetite out there at all to change the system, which may exacerbate the cleavages we've got going now, Paul. So what's the alternative?
Yeah, I think the alternative is for the Liberals to take a look and say, okay, we had seats in rural Ontario. What happened? I have an opinion on that. And Conservatives need to say, why aren't we making the advances in the 416 and narrow 905 that we have in the past? The answer to this lies, I think, within each of the parties. And the solution to it, I think, to overturn the system of democracy that the public supported, I think, 2-1 in the 2007 election. It was an overwhelming decision.
I think 5 ridings in favor of changing and all of the rest, again, 102 against.
Yeah, so that decision's been made. There is no appetite for democratic reform in Ontario, and certainly in a time when we have a minority government and are looking at some significant economic storm clouds, this would be the wrong time to come up with changing the system that we have now.
Robin, you're shaking your head a bit there.
I mean, I'd sit between the two of you, I guess, and say that I think that it isn't something one can ever close the door to permanently for the reasons you described. If we continue going down this slide, there'll be a point at which it's a crisis we cannot avoid. But we're not there yet, so I agree with Paul that I think the parties need to look inside themselves as to how to fix this problem. And I think what it means to pick up Katie's point about caucus management is that when the northern NDP members in the NDP caucus, I'm making this up, but I have some history on the subject, demand something for the North because they are the dominant political voice for the North that would not be fair to the South, then the leadership of the party has to say, I'm sorry, that's not the way we're going to govern as a group. And by the same token, I'm afraid that Mr. Hudak will have to slap down some rural conservatives who feel that they need things because of their predominance there that wouldn't be good for him as a prospective premier. So in the short term, the leaders are going to have to find ways of making their parties behave as if they represented the province as a whole, even if they don't.
That's hard to do.
It's very hard to do.
Let's do a for instance here. For example, there are people in northern and rural Ontario, and this may be why they abandoned the Liberals last night, who say every time people make a stink in the south about a gas plant, the premier just cancels it. But if we don't like the wind farms that are going up along the shores of Lake Huron or wherever, we're told we're NIMBYs and tough luck. I mean, that's a problem for the Liberals today, isn't it?
I actually think, as Paul said, we are going to have to take a serious look at the rural seats in terms of what happened, and it's going to be a challenge balancing the fact that it's mostly an urban caucus and doing that caucus management while at the same time building from that base for the next election, because that's what they're going to have to do, is break into those areas again. Having said that, in terms of the north, Michael Gravel, and we held on to both of our Thunder Bay seats, and
By
Rick
bigger margins,
Bartolucci,
actually.
despite a bit of a nail-biter at one point in the evening, he held on in Sudbury, and David Orzetti did extremely well in Sault Ste. Marie, and I think they all did well in those respective ridings because they've worked very hard for the North in their ridings as well, and they're seen as very good constituency MPPs, and that's what they've got to keep doing.
But the reality, Martin, is we seem to be a more divided province today with deeper cleavages among these different rural, urban, ex-urban, and so on.
I think so, and I think Mr. McGuinty didn't help matters by skipping the northern debate. That was a bad sign of kind of kissing off the north. I do think the Liberals tried to reach out to rural ridings with their agricultural stabilization program, which no one in the cities talks about, but which was an effort, but I think they were blown away, forgive me, by the wind turbine problem. And so there again, you're back to the green issue. Jim, I wanted to say on electoral reform, not just Ontario rejected it, but the United Kingdom also soundly trounced the notion of electoral reform. So I think if we want to try to help the system along, we have to set that aside for the time being. What I would say is that I think it's wrong to suggest that our system is the root cause of this kind of alienation. I think it magnifies and amplifies it, and so the solution has to be found elsewhere, not through the shortcut of electoral reform.
I have to come back to Martin. In BC, they voted 58% to change their system, and the politicians said that's not enough.
Well, they said the floor was 60, or the threshold was 60.
60, and it also passed in 97% of the ridings by more than 50%, and they said that's not good enough to change the system. I mean, we're happy to take an absolute control of the House with 38% of the vote, but God forbid 58% should change the system. So the politicians, it's like the fox guarding the chicken coop. They don't want to change the system because it benefits them. But I just want one more quick point. I'm concerned about the future, and if you look at demographics in the polls, the youngest voters are always the strongest Green. In fact, the Greens come out in some polls as the majority, the largest choice for young people, 18 to 24. And so by not having that choice, although this program accepted, represented in the debates or in the media, like there was a blackout on the Greens with the exception of this show and a couple of other local programs and shows and papers, it's not giving the voice to their primary concern. And so for me, it's a concern about the legitimacy of democracy and the future of it.
Robin.
Can I just add a glass half full element to this discussion, and that is, on another network last night, I was looking at the boards for 4 hours as they were rolling in front of my eyes. And one thing that absolutely astonished me was the collapse of the monopoly of Anglo-Saxon men as candidates. The parties have, perhaps in spite of themselves, perhaps they get some credit for having reached out, really made an effort to represent the face of Ontario in terms of who their candidates are. And there were constituencies last night where 4 out of 4 candidates were not Anglo-Saxon white guys. To me, that was a huge statement of how successfully the system, despite the foxes being in charge of the hen house, had been willing to absorb some degree of change from outside in a way that hasn't happened in a lot of other cultures.
Let's not get too politically wonkish here, but it's also worth noting that yet again, this province has decided to hedge its bets. For some reason, for many, many years, This province tends to put one party in power in Ottawa and a different party in power in Ontario, and they've done it again. You've watched this for a long time. Do you know why?
No, I don't know why, and I don't ascribe to the theory, because that wouldn't explain why Brian Mulroney won a crushing majority in 1984, or why Dalton McGuinty was elected in 2003. So there is that belief, but I think once you take a look at the individual elections, what's going on at the time. Look, in 1985, Frank Miller got the result that he got on his own. In 2003, Ernie Eves got the result that he got on his own. And I think it had very little to do with who was operating up in Ottawa.
You know what, though? David Peterson says, and again, I'm doing what I said I wouldn't do here, but Peterson does say in 1985, there were no Liberal governments anywhere in the country. And Brian Mulroney had just won 211 seats federally the year before. Less than a year before. And that Ontarians may have somehow instinctively, enough of them, decided we can't give absolutely all the power to just one party.
I don't know why this is so strange. I mean, it seems to be perfectly reasonable. I mean, why wouldn't you hedge your bets?
If I may, one of the most persuasive things I've heard Tim Hudak say is, I'm a voter at the doorstep and I hate the HST and I hate those hidden eco taxes and I don't want favoritism and all of those things, but I'm going to vote for Dalton McGuinty because I have a Conservative government in Ottawa. I don't think most voters actually go that way. I just want to say, as a postscript to Jim's lament, it may surprise you to know that I actually personally support electoral reform. I just don't think it's going to happen in our lifetimes. So I think it's time to find other solutions, and one of those is internet voting. If we can bank on the web, and if we can order our funerals on the web, we should be able to vote on the web.
How about let's pick up on this, because we got 5 minutes to go, and we really should spend some time talking about why turnout was 47.6%. Okay, we don't have internet voting. 16-year-olds also can't vote yet. You got to be 18. And we had this idea floated in one of our agenda camps. What do you think of the idea of lowering the voting age to 16 as a means of getting people into politics at an earlier age? And presumably, if something takes, get them at 16, you got them for life, the theory is.
I'm open to the idea myself.
That doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement.
But I think similar to what we were just saying on reform of the system, I'm not sure that resolves some of the issues that are coming out of it. I think so some 16-year-olds vote, well, why aren't they voting when they're 18 right now? You could make the same argument for 18-year-olds. Let's hook them in then, and then they'll vote for the rest of their lives. But that's actually where we see low voter turnout, is in those kind of 18, as Jim was talking about, 18 to 24.
I have no idea, but I'm going to throw a theory out here. At 18, you're an adult. You're on your own. You're off living at university, chances are. 16, you're still living in your parents' house. They can schlep you to the polls in a way they can't when you're 18.
So we're going to make parents make their 16-year-olds go and vote, and then it'll happen?
Exactly.
Why not?
I think we're relying on a few too many things there.
Anybody who needs to get to the polls can phone any one of the parties, and we will get them there. That's part of the tradition. I have, and this is a very personal view. I mean, if you're not voting, and you choose not to vote, up to you. There are campaigns that, as Martin said quite eloquently, no, you're not going to find the perfect candidate. I haven't found one yet. But you vote for the person who's the least unpleasant to you or the least unacceptable. So if somebody doesn't vote, to me they are declaring non-involvement in the system and have absolutely no right to then complain about it. By the same token, I don't think it's up to political parties to be getting people out to vote just because we want to increase the percentage of voters. We want to get our voters out, but certainly not someone else's.
Yeah, but it's important for democracy.
Well, it's important to democracy, but it's a participatory democracy.
No, but at some point,
forcing people to participate when they don't want to.
There are boundaries to this that we have to respect. I mean, Jim's absolutely right. If you go down to a circumstance where 35% of the people are electing a majority government on the strength of 15% of them having voted one direction, that's not a democracy. And I think that, I mean, here's my holy grail. We've talked about this on this program on other occasions, Stephen. I'd like to have a sunsetted law for 10 years that does what the Australians do. Move the voting day to Sunday, which is, after all, a holiday for families, that they can do things together. Make it compulsory and see what happens. And have to have it reinstituted at the end of 2 elections. If people are unhappy with it, it would die. I bet what would happen is what happens in Australia, that an enormous number of people come out to vote all over the system, all over the world, but a few of them do what they call the donkey vote, and they scratch out their ballot, and that's perfectly kosher.
What's the penalty for not voting in Australia?
$50, $75. It's not. You don't go to jail.
And what's the turnout now?
99%.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's
As an
that high.
Australian, I actually agree with that.
You are
but-
an Aussie?
Yeah, I am.
I didn't know that.
But having said that, I just think as much as we would like to do these things, coming out of last night, given this minority situation we're in, this is not going to be top of mind for people for long, unfortunately.
I
anyway.
agree with Robin on this. We always do. I don't think it's going to, again, like electoral reform, it's not going to happen in Canada. Perhaps Jim and I would agree that if you brought in a graduated license system for voters and you allowed people to vote green for the first 2 years,
Well, Jim says
on that.
Jim says that.
Love that. I love that.
The other thing we haven't talked about is the majority of votes in this system are wasted. So if you're a conservative...
What does that mean?
Well, what it means is if you're a conservative in Toronto, it really doesn't matter. Like, you are wasting your time going to the poll, because 400 to 1,000 can go to the polls in Toronto and not a single MPP is going to be elected. You are wasting your vote if you're up in northern Ontario and you're voting Liberal. You're wasting your time. Your
Except
time
where the Liberals won.
except there. But you are wasting your time, in certain rural ridings by voting Liberal or NDP. Like,
Okay.
why take this time out of your precious schedule? Because it's made no difference your whole life, and you're told you're wasting your vote by the
How about his idea?
strategic voters.
What do you think of his idea? Mandatory turnout. You got to
I
by
like
law.
it. I like it because it's our civic duty.
but
This
if
is
you're not going to
Well,
agree
but
with
forcing people to do
my
the civic
proposal,
duty-
if you won't agree with my proposal for 16-year-olds, which I thought was a slam dunk for you,
I
do
would
think-
agree with
I do
16-year-olds too,
think
and mandatory. I would agree with both.
Seriously, internet voting is something that everyone can agree on,
Absolutely.
and that's the first short-term fix, and it's needed now.
How about you show up to the polls, you identify who the 4 main party leaders are, you get 2 votes. Would that appeal to you? How about that?
$50.
Okay. Guys, thanks all for coming in on the day after what was a very wee small hours of the morning, as Mr. Sinatra would have called it. Who do you want me to thank first? I always like to ask the director where he wants me to go. There we go. Robin Sears and Katie Telford on that side of the table, followed by Paul Rhodes in the middle of the table, followed by Martin Redcon and Jim Harris on the other side of the table. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it.